You got to pay your bills, Bill.
Well, you know how it is. You let them slide 10 or 12 months, and then they eventually get you.
They don't want to store the Hornets in that area.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, pay my bill too, will you? I'm out.
Yeah, I know. I talked to them, George, and they said it's going to be 2 o'clock or later.
2 o'clock or later, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for calling.
Yeah, so I think this is a full house, and I'll turn it over to you, Chairman Teskey. We've got a couple items on the agenda. One is just a brief summary of what you have coming up for your August 11th agenda. And then we also, as you saw on the agenda, position to talk to you a little bit more in depth about some efforts that we are beginning as we review our landscaping section. Oh, sorry, let me.
2 o'clock.
Maybe if we can ask everybody to mute.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea.
That would be great. Maybe just to recap again, just a quick summary of what we have coming up on the 11th, and then taking some time. Lance Glass is with us here in the office to talk about approaches to landscaping code revisions. And I know we've visited with you briefly on that in the past. So Chairman Teskey, I'll look to you if you want me to maybe just give a high level summary of what we are seeing for the 11th, and then we can jump into the next. Oh, you're on mute.
I muted myself in compliance with my earlier comment and then started talking. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's go that way.
Excellent. So just a quick summary. So we actually only currently have one item for August 11th. We had another one, but we have since withdrawn that request due to some kind of other long-standing issues with the associated projects. So that will be rescheduled here sometime in the future. But the request you have in front of you is a comprehensive plan amendment and rezoning. So this is for the Mallard View LLC project. Most of you, I think, were in attendance and participated in that previous request. This is for a property off of 24 Road. The original request was to rezone the entirety of the property. I think it's about 17 acres to a C1. So they have, with your direction, they did not forward that on to to City Council. But have modified the application and will be hearing that on the 11th. So that's the extent of that agenda. I did want to maybe just report back on one other item, which is just circling back on action taken by the City Council. So last night, City Council had a meeting, and amongst other things, heard the West Junction Metropolitan District service service plan request. So just wanted to let you know that they had taken in your recommendation and unanimously approved that service plan as well. So that has gained a fair bit of traction, and we will move after this point, should they successfully make it through the election in November to actually create that district, then the city would begin negotiating with them on some intergovernmental agreements outlining our obligation versus the service districts or the metropolitan districts obligation. So just wanted to bring that to a close and let you know what the result of that conversation was at City Council.
Appreciate that update. That's good to know.
Yeah, so that's it, unless there's any other questions about what's coming up. And if not, we can turn it over to Lance Glass to talk about our approach and some activity on the landscaping section of our code.
Looks like we don't have any questions. Let's roll on.
Great. So I just wanted to check back in about the landscaping section of our code, give you a peek into the progress so far, and then get your take on a few potential action items here, as well as introduce you to some concepts specifically related to landscaping in the right-of-way. One conversation that's been very fruitful so far has been with parks and specifically the forestry team over there. So just going to kind of run through where we're at so far. I will share my screen now, if possible. Let's see. Well, it might not be possible. So in our last conversation, one of the questions that I had for you was what kind of goals are most appropriate to pursue with this potential code amendment here for landscaping. And one of the
Yep.
You guys can see my screen now? Great. So I've highlighted the three things that came up as the priorities from this group, and certainly if anyone's feelings have changed, we could talk through that as well. But we talked about a range of resource and habitat related questions, character related, but the big emphasis that was made by the Planning Commission in May when we discussed this was flexibility and accessibility and ease of use, and making sure that without quality sacrifices, that what we're asking for from a landscaping perspective is not hamstringing people in their design approach, is not ruinous from a budget perspective or a pro forma perspective. And so would just like to open the floor briefly to see if that is still consistent before we kind of dive into some of the action items.
That's generally consistent with my recollection, Lance. I don't know if others have any comments they want to make here or not.
I would echo that. That is very consistent with what we talked about, and certainly the way I think about it. When you say the first line, urban form / character, can you just explain a little bit what you mean by character there?
Yeah, specifically we had talked about character by area. There are a couple of plan documents that have been adopted over the last couple decades that speak to specific landscaping needs in different areas. I think the two best examples there are downtown and the Redlands. Downtown, the downtown plan and some other documents emphasize the desire for a robust kind of green infrastructure in that area. Obviously, the city invests in that pretty strongly. And then also that in the downtown, there are special zoning regulations for that B2 zone district that actually curtail landscaping requirements, kind of recognizing the specific urban form of buildings in that area and landscaping corresponding to that. And then in the Redlands, there are plans that emphasize kind of maintaining that desert feel, the kind of existing natural vegetation up there, and not trying to do what we think of as a kind of urban forest in that neighborhood. So that was kind of the emphasis with that, Ken.
Good. That's what I thought, and because that's an important aspect to me, and I just want to make sure it was in there. Redlands, and there may be other similar areas that abut natural areas, and the goal really there should be renaturalization rather than like creating something that looks like humans created instead of nature. So I'm very glad to see
right.
That. Thank you.
I think a really good example of that contrast is the ridges versus say Redlands Mesa or other nearby developments. I think the Ridges was developed to the general standard for the city at that time, or even the county, and then that the Redlands Mesa project has developed kind of on its own separate landscape standard with that plan development. So that might illustrate that.
Yeah, well, my own little development out here on Little Park, with Scott Peterson's help, we finally just had to do a plan development because there were so many issues like that with the landscaping, and then some of the other issues, because we're really on the desert here. So we ended up doing it that way, but it would have been nice if there was already something in the code and we didn't have to jump through all those hoops.
That's great feedback, Ken. I think PD is a good mechanism for that, but if the idea is to have an easier route to that in the Redlands or elsewhere, we might want to look at a different mechanism.
Exactly. Good, thanks.
Has there been any of those initial meetings with like and we do kind of a subcommittee or something along the lines for this landscaping?
No, Keith, that hasn't happened yet. You will be in the loop on those. I think at this point, we've been waiting for the opportunity to do those in person, and that just does not seem realistic at this point. So I think we're going to have to go with the digital option here soon, but we will be folding you in per your request on those.
Okay, and I'm volunteering to be on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
So then the only other element that I would add when considering this is I'm not sure what's currently going on and if this warrants discussion or not, but there got to be a point where you had landscape requirements in areas where perhaps the property didn't have access to irrigation, and then Clifton Water, Ute Water, they started having completely different water tap rates and water rates. It sort of forced a developer into this expense that essentially kind of created I think contrived is the right word, kind of what Ken was speaking to in terms of we're making it look a certain way for some reason, and then on top of it, that mandate is forcing a higher expense and cost for the developer, while those costs are in play because of the water purveyor's desire to make sure that water is going for true domestic uses and not other uses for the measure of like water conservation, that sort of thing. So I just don't know where that conflict sits out there and if there's a solution. So I'd be interested in knowing if there is such a thing.
Yeah, Keith, that definitely is a real issue. Ute Water, for example, and their general policy as it relates to using their domestic taps for irrigation. And you're right, that is definitely something out there to be solved. And I think we should probably circle around on that. But to my mind, one of the key questions is really a policy question as to whether it is a policy priority that domestic water not be used for irrigation purposes from a conservation perspective, or if it is a greater priority that we enable full implementation of the landscape code in all scenarios. But thanks for flagging that. That certainly is an issue to be cooperated on. And,
Yeah, sorry, Lance. That's another one I can speak to from personal experience. And Keith's spot on with pointing that out, because there's this requirement that you have to have a permanent in-ground watering system, which is kind of oxymoronic if you're going to be doing xeriscaping and renaturalization. You really just need to water those plants until they get started, and then they're good to go. Maybe they need some spot watering in dry years, but and there's just also areas when you get out to the periphery where there just is no water source. There's no irrigation,
right.
And to create a separate tap, I mean, each house will have a tap, but I think I got quoted like $30,000 or something to create a tap for landscaping for domestic water, and then I would have had to build the irrigation system itself and then pay for the water. It's just like, okay, I have 8 houses out here. I think there went the viability of my project. And it was completely unnecessary. So we got around it with the PD, but I do believe with what Lance is talking about, reprioritizing here, that maybe that sort of mandatory irrigation system can come out and something more flexible and appropriate for these lower water use projects can be put in instead.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ken. Let's touch on that as we get to a note on xeriscaping on one of these upcoming slides, because I think that'll line up really well. So what I've done here is just broken down some action items that we are either pursuing or can pursue on each of these 3 primary goals here. Let's see. So in terms of quality and quality of results. This is something I've been in discussion with Rob Davis, our city forester, and others at the Parks Department in terms of quality. So as I mentioned back in May when we discussed this, we have a relatively underpublicized and arguably unrefined list of acceptable species that developers are supposed to consult as they compile their landscape plans. And that's not something that has been, I think, fully implemented, but one of the things that we'd like to do before we do that is actually vet and make sure that we have the right list. So that's currently in Parks' hands as they're going through that with some of their more horticultural expertise to make sure that we actually have the right list. For example, the list that we have right now identifies elms and ashes as priority species for tree plantings. Obviously, times have changed when it comes to the susceptibility of those to disease. So we're trying to make sure that we adapt that both to kind of current conditions and then also making sure that just from a best practices horticultural standpoint, that is aligned. One of the other action items that we could look at from a quality perspective is requiring greater detail in landscape plans, particularly when it comes to the documentation of existing conditions. And that might be something that would be at odds with the flexibility and accessibility goals and kind of ease of use. So wanted to flag that. Another quality control item that we're looking at, and this is an issue that is really affected by just human hours attached to this. But as you know, we have our InterGov system to circulate land use applications to both internal departmental reviewers and then also outside agencies. And in past, it has been considered to have Parks or the city forester specifically as a reviewer of landscape plans. So the scope of that.
Have we budgeted for a second city forester?
And as Jamie has commented here, that is a huge task. And I have cautioned those guys as to the reality of that. So what we're doing is this month we're going to get Parks in there as kind of a pilot reviewer and have them look specifically at plantings in the right of ways. Recognizing that is a challenge from a human hours perspective, we're also going to have the city forester in here, I think, next week to do the first of what could be a couple little trainings for planners on key items in the landscape plans that we can keep an eye on and put together a checklist for planners to assist them in their reviews. So these are some of the potential quality items, and I guess I'd open up for comment here.
I have a few comments here, and I feel like I have to be upfront that this isn't going to be, this may not be well received, because here's the elements, the issues that I have with each of these. The working with Parks to refine acceptable species list, that could be okay to use that, especially if we have city forester training on anybody at Parks who's participating in this list. But I would not be in favor of this at all unless it very clearly identified that a licensed landscape architect could provide something outside of this acceptable species list. And it'd be okay if in doing so, they must identify that they're proposing things outside of that acceptable species list. But there's an inherent resistance from my perspective to put too much of this back into the city, which often is not trained and not innovative and up to date. And that's maybe being too presumptuous. That's just a relationship to history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And additionally, the state has already decided that anybody doing a landscape plan, and the city's code already requires them to be licensed landscape architects. Requiring greater deal in landscaping plans, my initial thought is hesitation and resistance to that, because I'm not sure what that will really achieve. You mentioned about existing conditions and getting into existing conditions versus what the impacts will be after a development could start to become more burdensome and not really generating the benefit related to the cost for the developer and the private sector. Parks as a reviewer, something would really have to be presented of significance to get me on board with that. The biggest thing that is killing economic development out there is the level of third-party review agencies, the timing of them, the expertise that they do, or most cases do not have in any particular area, and discussing more about how that's truly a benefit to the end project and our community and the developer. I need more information on there. There's my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, Keith, I really appreciate that. And one quick comment on the existing code as it relates to that list and then exceptions. No, not at all. Sorry, as we lost Bill. Here's your phone, Bill.
Actually, I'm back now.
Oh, Bill's back. All right. So the way that the code is currently written is that any developer must use species from that list or propose, as you're saying, Keith, and identify deviations from that list. So that is how it's currently written. One of the ways that could tie into the second bullet here is that we could simply require that developers flag anything that they're proposing that isn't on the list to ease review. So those two things would kind of have a synergy, and I think that speaks to what you're saying there, Keith, in terms of using this as a means to reduce the burden on everyone and simplify things rather than the other way around.
And then if I can just put out there, Lance, I believe if it's in our right-of-way, there's not really a choice. It needs to be from the acceptable list, and that's in another section of our code.
That's correct. So, and we will zoom in on that, but as Jamie is alluding to, there are really two lists. There's a private development list and then an overlapping plantings in the right-of-way list, and that is housed in forestry and is identified in the municipal code rather than the zoning code. Cruising along here with that feedback. On the flexibility front, we are also working with parks to determine what kind of additional equivalencies we could put in place. Right now, it is possible to exchange turf for trees to a certain extent. I think 10% of your tree count on a per square footage of turf basis can be exchanged. Similar things for trees and ground cover, shrubs and ground cover, et cetera. Those are kind of ad hoc as they are in the code right now and pretty limited. So we'd like to put together a more intuitive and centralized and actually introduce additional equivalency options to allow people to be able to make choices that respond to their particular development circumstances, and they're not just packing in trees for no reason. And this next point ties into Commissioner Scissors' comment. We currently have a xeriscape option in the code, but it is about, I don't know, 20 words long in the code, and it says, water-wise development, a developer can propose an alternative water-wise landscaping plan for the approval of the director. There is no parameter around that. There is no clarity as to whether that would exempt you from permanent irrigation or how that would look in terms of irrigation during the establishment period. So that's something that we want to work with Parks, and there's particularly Joe Brown over there who is a bit of a xeriscape expert, and he's working on trying to put together a draft that would actually clarify what a xeriscape option would look like and how we'd review that. It may be that even if we can't do a Parks Department or kind of expert review for all landscape plans, that we could establish a mechanism to make sure that xeriscape plans get seen by an expert, absent that more robust irrigation system.
If it makes anybody feel more comfortable, at least our city forester right now, when we hired him, and I expect he still is, was recognized as the top guy in Colorado when it came to forestry issues.
He's very good.
Great.
And then finally, oh yeah, Ken?
Lance, can I make one point here? And this
Sure.
maybe is something that would be dealt with later on, but xeriscape is actually pretty broad and ranges from just renaturalization to highly decorative landscaping that just uses xeriscape. And so at some point I'd like to see kind of like a branch point there where if the purpose is just to restore what was there naturally versus using xeriscape, as a decorative and aesthetic type of thing. And I think the watering and the plant selection, the diversity, all that would be a lot different, even though it's in the same general playbook.
Yeah, Ken, that's really helpful, and I appreciate that a lot. I think a revegetation, a specific set of strategies and potentially a specific set of code updates aimed at clarifying what that would look like would be really helpful. Currently, we are using the definition of xeric, which is that it requires no additional watering after establishment. That is based on your actual climate zone, that provides sufficient water naturally. But as you're saying, that can still be applied in several directions, right?
Right.
So I appreciate that a lot. One of the other issues as it relates to flexibility is an area where we may see quality and flexibility in conflict. Currently, our code has several instances where we require a minimum amount of diversity. And this is for, I think, aesthetic reasons as well as stability reasons. For example, right now, we've got a lot of elms. That's going to be a problem because there's a pest that is killing our elms. And so that's why we want diversity. However, currently our diversity requirements are all diversity of species, which we feel is, from an actual impact standpoint, is pretty minimal, in that you could actually meet the letter of that requirement by simply having 2 kinds of elms or 3 kinds of elms, and that could make up your whole, diversity requirement. So there are some points in the code where we'd like to see the word species replaced with the word genus, which would have that actual, pretty minor tweak that would have a pretty big impact in terms of required diversity, but would reduce flexibility, I think, kind of inherently. So just wanted to vet that with folks and see if there was any comment on that kind of action.
I think that's really hard to make too broad and general rules about. It's not that hard to state what the goals and the principles are, but for some projects it may make sense and for others it may not. So I certainly wouldn't want, you can swing the pendulum too far the other way, right? That's really what you're getting at. So I think maybe you have to deal with that in language about the goals and, about diversity, what the reasons for it are and what you're aiming for. And then as long as there's a licensed landscaper, let them, let them negotiate those waters and make their proposal. And if it calls for more or less diversity, as long as it makes sense with the principles in their project, we don't want to hold them to some preordained formula. That's what we're trying to get away from.
Right, Ken, I appreciate that. And I definitely, with that comment, you get at the crux of the challenge here, which is that this is obviously a qualitative issue, that our mechanism right now is primarily quantitative, right? And it's very prescriptive. And that has the positive impact of creating a predictable environment, at least for developers, and knowing, even if it's frustrating in terms of the letter of it, at least knowing that there is a letter of the rule. But I think what I'm generally hearing is that there's also an appetite to open the door where possible to a more qualitative perspective guided by principles and aims and guidelines rather than tight stipulations.
Yeah, and the key is, and Keith brought this up, and you reiterated, is the involvement of a true landscape professional, and not just, building with not dealing with the project, the development owner, right? You're dealing with his or hers, like, hired professional certified landscaper. And, if they know what the goals are and what the boundaries are, then letting them have some flexibility and creativity. And then the question at that point would be like, okay, well, who would decide, who's a higher authority than a professional certified landscaper that we would have look at and say, I don't know that we need to get into that, but I hear what Keith is saying on that. At that point, like, so who are we going to have look over their shoulder if they're already the pros? So, but
yeah, and the reality is, I think our department, we don't have that person, and Parks does. But as Jamie remarked, being a forester is already a full-time job, and so that's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, one.
Number.
Yeah, right. And then on the accessibility question, I think this is where we can make some pretty big wins. Right now, the team over at Parks is shopping up kind of a supplemental one-pager to be distributed to those that are contemplating development that would involve a landscape plan. And it would hit on 5, 6, or 7 key items that we see as easy to miss, but relatively easy to execute if you don't miss it. And some of that will be on the next slide, but this would help people right off the bat see this as a known quantity and not be as surprised and lay out the landscaping process right from go. We have a similar sheet that we have from GJPD that we just give out as kind of a boilerplate item for people to review, and this is something that we could kind of try to get ahead of the curve with. Another, obviously people want online tools, and the fact that we have currently a list of species, that we see as acceptable, that's not actually available to the public, definitely makes it harder to use. So we would hope to house all of this information either through community development and or through parks, and have that available online. And then finally, from an accessibility perspective, looking through the code, there are a lot of places where minor changes could be used just to improve clarity. I think a lot of people, especially the mom and pop type developer, looks at the code and finds it a little impenetrable. And so this is simply noting that as we go through to try to make adjustments in what the code says, also trying to make adjustments in how it's said. And I'm, Jamie, I'm sure you'll be a party to that as well. So these are some of the key action items that we're looking at, and before we kind of transition to part 2 here, I just would like to circle around and get any more summary thoughts from folks on these.
I think you're on the right track from my perspective.
All right, I'll take that. So just briefly here, wanted to introduce this other concept, which we didn't talk about so much last time around, and these are our landscape assets in the right-of-way. And this is where, again, we really are overlapping with parks and have to some extent some different concerns, but also where this overlaps to some extent with public works. And a lot of it is regulated by the Chapter 8 of the Municipal Code, which has a section on trees. I believe this is overall the section on safety, interestingly enough. And there are some points where this is potentially even in conflict with the landscape code, so we want to get those things in line. And actually, it might be 8.36 if you're looking for it. I'm drawing a blank on that. But the trees section speaks specifically to the city's assets, trees in the right of way. One of the things it covers, which is overlapping with the landscaping section, is protection of trees during development. And Keith, this gets at that existing landscape features question. The landscaping code speaks to identifying and protecting significant landscape features. In most communities, that would be the corollary of what would be called a quote-unquote significant trees chapter or section. And usually municipalities define a minimum caliper size or diameter for a tree that would be deemed significant. And then there are either hard and fast rules saying that you cannot remove such a tree, or more often you see kind of penalties. So if you want to remove, a 24-inch cottonwood, then you're going to be planting 24 new cottonwoods. These types of trade-offs. And our significant landscape features also speaks to non-biotic, abiotic features. So bluffs and escarpments and similar. These are two sections of both municipal code and zoning development code that have not been particularly well implemented, that have had some kind of high-profile missed opportunities recently. But this is something that I would really like some input on from this group, because I understand that from a development perspective, one might really not want to be told that they have to keep that cottonwood, or that there is some huge penalty for removing a significant tree that's right in the middle of your buildable area. And so I'd like to get a sense as to whether there is an appetite for pursuing some kind of hard and fast rule about trees that simply cannot be removed, whether that kind of make up for it type mechanism is better, or whether we need to seriously question whether that is pushing it too far in this community.
Can I just clarify that? You're talking about our trees that are in our right-of-way already, the citizens' trees?
So this would apply in both cases. Maybe before we open up the floor, I should do some clarity on that.
Okay.
So when it comes to trees in the right-of-way, only parks is supposed to remove those, but it is possible for a developer to request as part of their development that those trees be removed or replaced or similar. Likewise, a developer can propose to remove or replace trees on their private property during private development, but it doesn't have to be done by parks.
Talking about.
So in terms of protection and preservation of significant trees, that applies in the right-of-way and outside of it. In the right-of-way, parks has a little more room to control.
Not a little more, we get a control.
We get 100% room. Yeah.
And to maybe simplify that, and Jamie, you can confirm this, but you may not need to differentiate between the two, because hell, we can't even successfully do, like a cool detached walk downtown where the landscaping in between the sidewalk and the road has these big trees and everything else, because of concerns of, that being traffic issues or not traffic issues, but like safety issues with big trees in the right of way. So I think that stuff is kind of already taken care of to some extent. And as Jamie just noted, the private sector has no say in what they want to do with that sort of stuff anyway. So we may be able to just drill this back to only within the private development. It's not already allocated as within an existing right of way, and be clear on that so that there's not any confusion about what's happening on proposed right of ways or something like that, because wouldn't want a scenario where you come in and propose these roads are here and there and there's a tree that has to be taken out to do that, and all of a sudden that becomes part of a can't do that in the right of way thing. I don't anticipate that happening, but getting that clarity on right of way versus what's happening on the private land would be advantageous, certainly.
Yeah, and I would agree with Keith. we should not mess with the right of way because the developer has nothing to do with that anyway.
Although the developer is required to water and maintain those assets.
Well, yeah, that's true. He has to maintain them, but he can't have any say, even if the tree might impede part of his building plans if it's in the right of way.
Right. Right.
Lance, I thought you said the developer could request a tree removal in a right of way, but it would never be his decision. But supposing he had an alternate acceptable, really needed to remove one tree for a particular reason and had, a good strategy to mitigate the loss of that tree, that he could request that of the parks, or did I misunderstand that?
You understood that correctly. And if the tree is to be replaced, there is a mechanism within our code already that explains how that tree is to be replaced. Currently, if a developer requests that a tree be removed from the right of way, they need to replace it, I believe, with a 2 caliper inch tree in the same development area. However, many other municipalities have pursued a different mechanism there, and that is that a developer, in removing that tree, instead of replacing it in that location, should simply pay into a fund that the Parks Department would then use to install right-of-way trees more broadly. And that would give Parks more flexibility to try to reinvest that in another location. It's something that's been floated by Parks. It's something that I see as a logistical challenge in terms of trying to introduce that mechanism. Would be interested to see if folks see a significant value in that.
I certainly wouldn't object looking, exploring it. I think it's be hard for any of us to express an opinion because we probably just aren't that familiar with it, but unless somebody else is. But if it's something that's being done elsewhere and it just on the surface sounds like it might have some merit, I think that's worth exploring because it would just add to the flexibility and the options that both the city and the developer have.
Yeah.
All right, then that's good direction in terms of exploring it.
That's actually in Chapter 8. It's not in the Zoning and Development Code, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not likely to actually come back to Planning Commission.
Correct.
Okay.
So the last thing before we wrap up, and this gets on, again, that preservation of significant landscape features, specifically on private property, and I'll just cruise through so we're not looking at that slide anymore. I do want to hear from folks as to whether and to what extent it is appropriate to look at firmer requirements around preservation of significant trees. It's currently very limited. It's up to the discretion of the community development director, and it's not something that we have really required anyone to do in quite some time, to my understanding. Do we see it as generally advisable that we start to implement that to protect major landscape features, including trees, or is that something that we want to leave without teeth moving forward?
I would comment that because you can't clearly identify that I think we should steer very, very, very far away from it from a number of reasons. Private property rights, the ability for organized opposition to come to a hearing, and we haven't figured out, and when I say we, it's not just this community, but we haven't figured out how to handle public settings and mob mentality and not just wane to it, unfortunately. So until we do, that would be a huge leverage stick to stifle and halt any project for any reason, because you could just come out and say that there's significant this or significant that without a metric. So I'm pretty cautious about that, just because of our own process and being able to manage that. as well as the private sector rights. And ultimately, that's the market's decision on what to do with those sorts of things. If there's a development that has features that are attractive, then those typically have more call. So I'm pretty cautious about getting into something that is not as identifiable. You know, for example, the ridgeline stuff that's out there, you could originally kind of maybe have the same debate on that, but that was gone through, and the maps, you know, you can clearly identify on any property where you have a ridgeline consideration and how that impacts the property right up front, and that impacts, you know, your valuations and everything that goes along with it. So unless we determined or allocated the resources to go through all undeveloped or developed properties within the foreseeable city of Grand Junction limits and under our purview, and then identified what those significant features are, I would say going down that road has a lot of pitfalls.
I would agree. Keith is way more eloquent than I ever am, but if we start, you know, you're gonna spend 5 years defining what's a significant feature, and no two people are going to agree on it. So I think the farther we stay away from that, the better we are.
Yeah, I have to say, I lean that way, but I also don't think that we should completely ignore the issue. One of the questions to ask, I think, would be, well, if a developer is proposing to remove a feature or cover it or whatever, who and what is affected? If it's just the neighbors who say, oh, you know, we always liked looking at that or something, that's different than if it would, you know, be visible from the entire community, or or have some sort of physical impact or something like that. So I think there is room for like expressing, you know, to try to maintain as much of the natural character as possible, things like that. And to maybe deal with some of them on a case-by-case basis to see if it's actually hurting or harming anybody in any, you know, real way, other than they've been used to treating that person's private property like a park for 20 years, which that's the slippery slope I think we all want to stay out of, because we know from our meetings where, you know, we get into that all the time, and but that's just the nature of growth and development.
That's all really helpful, and I think speaks to the observed reality. One question, I guess, more specifically, if we're taking the tack that we probably should revise out the current condition of the code, which is very vague and very much to the discretion of community development director at this point. You know, one option would be to soften that further and make it more of a guiding principle and less of something that we can actually enforce based on that. Or the other direction would be to set a clearer set of standards, right? To establish a width of a tree, a size of a tree that would be a candidate, or something along those lines. Thoughts on setting, pursuing a clearer definition rather than trying to get rid of the principle almost entirely?
Again, I wouldn't be against that as long as it was really focused on what the actual impacts were, like number of inches of a tree or something. It's, to me, that doesn't mean much. But just in the scenario that, say, the neighbors might, if something was on the edge, the developer wanted to do it, the neighbors, you know, are objecting because they've always had that. it would be good if we had some language that, forced the conversation to be like, okay, what are you actually using that you losing, sorry, to the neighbors, what are you actually losing that you have rights to, that are not just part of that private property that they should be able to do, what they want with. I think that would help us in those conversations, and also add some clarity if it was more like based on what are the harms or what are the effects, what's the actual complaint, other than, sort of a NIMBY thing. But I don't think that's hard to measure, like a bluff more than 15 feet or a tree more than 3 inches or something like that, because that could be very different from one property to another.
Right.
And some of you will remember that when we discussed the trail, and I go back to a decision that I sat on where we had a proposed urban trails map. And we were just drawing lines for proposals, and somebody said, with what I thought was some pretty good clarity, unfortunately, if you guys draw a map that has proposed trail lines on it, and that map is not locked up somewhere where no one ever sees it, those lines become permanent. And I think the more we quantify what's an important feature, whether it's the trunk width of a tree or the size of a boulder, whatever, the more difficult we make it for the planning department to be flexible with people who want to develop their property. And I think the more flexibility we leave in the hands of the planning department, planning director, the better off we are.
And I agree completely with Bill.
And I would
Hear
add
that, Tamara?
Well, I appreciate that vote of confidence in not just me, but my staff here predominantly. They're the ones that manage this. And maybe I'll provide a couple examples. And I actually see this kind of less becoming a conversation that is a conversation with the public, frankly, and more a direct conversation between my staff and a developer or someone proposing a specific development. Let me give you maybe a couple different types of examples. So when we have general language about protecting assets or things like an important signature tree or something of that nature in the community, the question is it significant? Is it healthy enough to preserve? So kind of the technical aspects of the value of that tree. I'm going to focus on trees just because I think that's probably an easy example. And if we had weak language in our code, which is kind of what we have now, then we'd say, all right, well, identify it on your site plan and go ahead and pull it out, but at least we know you recognized it. And off we go through the design process. Now, on the kind of stronger code side, you might have a more intensive conversation about, are there opportunities to preserve it? Are there opportunities to design around it? Can you shift building envelopes or parking areas to try to preserve that? And so that's kind of the next step, right? So a little bit more interactive and active assessment by our staff here and conversations with the developer about, is their ability to preserve that significant feature, and however we can define that. And there's certainly ways to do that. And then the more strong on the very other end of that spectrum is you absolutely need to preserve it. And with that, all of these types of trees qualify for this significant feature. And again, size is a pretty common used measurement for what starts that conversation about should it be preserved or not. So there's a spectrum. I will say that, putting language in the code that's aspirational is interesting, but not highly effective if that's really a goal of the community to preserve features of sites such as trees or other types of elements. Obviously, the other end of the spectrum is having something very definitive in there that is very defensible and easy for staff to determine. And then there's that in between where can we at least have a conversation? Are there things you can do in your site plan development that could work around or otherwise work to preserve that asset? So in my mind, that's kind of the spectrum. Again, what we have now, I just don't see as particularly effective. Again, aspirational, but doesn't really have any teeth behind it.
I'd like to add too that when we're trying to figure out, and Ken, to your point too, how do we, what significant features can we identify? So we have tools in place already that is either directly referenced in the code or the code references another entity that governs those things. So, in the example of a hill, right, a big bluff, we have the ridge line development lines already established. We also have the slope map that identifies, what slopes can and can't have homes on it, and inherently with that slope, it would trigger into bluffs. It's anything above 10% starts to have implications on it. Then when you have any water features or whatnot, that falls into different drainage elements, as well as anything that's significant enough water feature and is identified on the USGS maps with a little blue line. That opens its own doors into full Corps of Engineers and environmental elements as well. So as I'm trying to kind of think on this, like what would we be identifying? The only one that doesn't seem to have direct tools already in place to govern that is trees, right? Any particular kind of tree or size sort of thing. And then the other one that sort of fell in the wings here was wildlife. And we do have a review agency of the DOW or CPW at this point that speaks to that stuff as well. So, when you boil it down, I'm not sure what significant features we'd be talking about here that we would generate new code on that wouldn't risk conflicting with other code or referenced entities, jurisdictional entities. And even if we did, how would we go about regulating those? So there's just some food for thought before we get too deep into that about what conflicts it has with existing code and jurisdictional entities.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Oh, someone.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. When you're done, I've got a comment on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate those. And maybe a couple points of, I'm not sure that I'd call them clarity, but one, I think like you alluded, we do have some mapping and some very kind of technical details on slopes and ridge lines and that we use as those projects come up. And like those are, in my mind, fairly easy. We've actually seen a couple code challenges in those, and at some point we'll bring that for some clarification, but generally they are on a fairly consistent path on how we manage those types of features, specifically related to terrain. And I think what we find generally is those sites that are complex or have topography or outcrops, whatever it may be, developers recognize that. It's added expense to, take your bulldozer, D9, whatever it is, and severely change the contours of the geographic landscape of property. And so most people, by default, from probably just a ROI, decide not to touch those types of features of a site. A couple, or at least one, I should say, recent example really focuses on trees. And I think Lance and I had highlighted that and kind of discovered some of the shortcomings of our code, where, for example, big site, a fairly dense development, very significant in my mind. And again, somewhat arbitrary without having a specific definition, but certainly our forester recognizes that there were some quite mature trees on the site that in his mind certainly would have been worth preserving. And we could have done it had we identified those on the front end and worked with some fairly, I would say minor, but certainly some site modifications, site design elements to be able to retain those features. Again, the question is that a goal? Does that align with where we want to be to have those more activated conversations about preserving those, or not?
Thanks. First, on follow up on some of Keith's comments, kind of what I'm hearing is a concern that we want to make sure we're not trying to create a solution that's looking for a problem. So I would agree with that philosophy. But the other thing I wanted to add maybe to what you were talking about initially, Tamara, which was very helpful, like kind of giving the spectrum, is just the option that sometimes is just to mitigate, if a developer really has a good reason to remove something that everybody's like, oh, I wish we didn't have to remove that, I mean, sometimes it can be worked around, like you said. There might be ways to shift things around. But also, it can be mitigated by putting up other trees elsewhere, just in the trees example. And just to make sure that the decisions are not based on sentimentality for that particular tree, because I mean, we've all been in situations where we've lost trees and then we plant some other ones and they grow up and then we're just fine with that, maybe even better. So just keeping on the spectrum of options, like, mitigating and trading off and mitigating, things like that, I would want to keep in there. I guess the last thing I would say is, I think when this gets to the committee that's going to be working on this, like maybe going through a case study, like maybe the one you mentioned, and really doing a deep dive on a case study, so the issues will come up in a real life fashion, and maybe even doing a review of other developments where these issues have come up, and just looking at specific examples, so we make sure we are actually looking for solutions to problems, or real life problems, and not just kind of hypotheticals. That's all.
Thank you everyone for the input. I think it's going to help steer this very much.
Yeah, maybe to that point, are there any other kind of remaining comments? I think Lance did a great job, and thank you for a very healthy discussion. It gives us some good direction as we continue the journey on this effort.
The internet's back on.
The technology is breaking down. Maybe that's a hint.
It was great to see you all.
Yeah, I actually had just a couple quick things, Chairman, if I may, mostly just housekeeping, but did want a couple minutes of your time if the technology will stick with us. So a couple of them are just updates. So our city council is, I believe, next week conducting interviews for the vacant seats on the Planning Commission. As you know, we've got 2 vacant seats right now. And then we will have 1 additional vacant seat this October, and that's Bill's seat.
I thought Keith's seat was up too.
I thought that too, but we actually had our clerk go back through and actually look at the records for participation and assignment to the Planning Commission, and she actually found that Keith can actually serve an additional term. I don't know if he's chosen to submit a letter of interest or not. I'll leave that to him to tell you all, or not. But he does have an additional term that he can serve if he wants to. So
if I was aware of that, I've already forgotten. So that's good news, and I will submit a letter if that's part of the process that I need to do. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, let me have Wanda reach out. I think I'd seen some correspondence, so let me just make sure she had sent that on its way to you, but I do believe that's accurate, and that you would need to submit a letter of intent for another term, or a letter of interest, I should say. So, and Chairman Teskey, I think you were copied on that correspondence, so am I missing something there?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. So
crap, that means that I did get it, and I'm not remembering, huh?
So that was the first piece. The other one, I just wanted to give you a heads up. We've had a number of conversations here between myself, our city manager, and our clerk. And our clerk really is responsible for our city council and how we engage. And as you guys know, we have evolved dramatically over the last few months as far as how we engage with our public, especially in the public hearing setting for participation. We ran into a couple of items in the now recent past where there were, I think, some misunderstandings from our public about how they could participate at the Planning Commission level. And again, we've kind of offered the smorgasbord, which I'm proud and happy that we've done that. But that smorgasbord has not also been available at our city council level. And so I think, frankly, it's created a little bit of confusion in our public about how they can participate in the public hearing setting, and the lack of consistency has been a challenge. And so our conversations have landed with direction that our Planning Commission, so you all, will follow the council's lead on how we offer engagement to our public for those public hearings, with the exception of GJ Speaks. And so, for example, we have been offering, as you guys experienced at our last meeting for Fairview Glen, offering phone conversations so people could call in, leave messages. They also could call in during the public hearing or participate online. So again, I was pleased to offer that, but that is not what our council currently wants to offer. And so to eliminate, I think, some confusion and certainly bring Planning Commission into alignment with City Council moving forward, we will no longer be offering those options. We will continue to preserve the GJ Speaks function, and we are actually been getting a lot of traction on that, which is great. So we have lots of viewers, and I actually will put on the agenda for next time we can share some of the analytics we've been collecting over the last few months on usage and engagement on that site, which is pretty exciting. So, let me pause there to see if there's any thoughts or comments on that piece.
Just goes to show you that you never want to be the Planning Commission and do something better than the City Council.
I won't be responding to that one. So, awesome. And just wanted to, again, give you guys a heads up that that will not be in our offerings. I think we'll see how the COVID situation continues, and I continue to press for, again, the smorgasbord. I think that though we haven't always seen action on all of those venues, it just provides a more robust opportunity. So, and then lastly, just wanted to follow up. I know I haven't been able to speak with you all in person for obvious reasons, but I did send out a memo on the process that we're in for our comprehensive plan and some of the delays we've experienced. So just wanted to see if there was any questions or concerns that I may be able to address. I haven't heard anything from you all, but wanted to give you an opportunity if there were some comments or questions regarding that memo.
I would just say, Tamara, that I really appreciate the detail you went to. It's nice to feel like we're in the process, even though we're on the outside of the process at this point. Yeah. So I don't have anything that I think we need additionally. You're keeping us up to date, and that's all we can ask.
Great. Well, thank you for that. It's been kind of a long road to hoe there, but we are actually making some very significant progress, and are pleased with where we're headed and what we've seen in draft form so far. So we still are anticipating early September to have a full draft available for hopefully a fairly quick staff review, and then our CPAC, of which Keith is involved in, will be seeing that next, and hopefully that vetting process will move smoothly through to actually having a public open house on that draft plan. So we'll certainly keep you apprised, but appreciate that sentiment, Bill, and we'll certainly keep you informed on where we're at in the progress. So, and if there's nothing else from the Planning Commission or Chairman, that is all I had for you today.
Well, I know I don't have anything. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to offer for the good of the cause here?
Nope. Thank you.
Great. Is there anybody that will not be able to attend the 11th? I know we did hear from Commissioner Gastos that he will not be able to participate, but is everybody else expected for next week?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Likewise. Bye, everyone.
Nice to see you, if only for 2 minutes.
Yeah.